Thank you. So welcome to all of you to the discussion this week in the Knowing Africa series. All of us speaking, in fact, today from the same place, the unceded territory of the Algonquin people in Ottawa, all from Carleton University, which is a very rare occurrence in the Knowing Africa series, because we usually try to spread ourselves between the continent of North America and the continent of Africa. But as it turns out, there are two of us who are from Africa too. So Mary, we'll count ourselves this time. In today's discussion is of this gem of a book by our colleague, Cati Coe. Cati is the Canada Research Chair in Migration and Care, I think is what it's called, based in the Political Science Department here at Carleton University. She's a political anthropologist who joined us last year from Rutgers, and it's been a just absolute delight to have another kindred spirit at Carleton. The book we are discussing is a continuation of her long-term work in Ghana and her ongoing interest in, I guess, being an anthropologist, we would say life cycle, and the relationalities between people across age and the scripts and inscription of various ways in which we understand, or at least people in Ghana understand the relationships between different categories of people within different social arrangements. And to discuss it, we have two great colleagues also from Carleton, Rianne Mahon, who is it's such an honor to have you participate, Rianne, that you're such a giant in the field of social policy. Someone whose work we've all used over time. Rianne is an emeritus professor of political economy at Carleton, but before that, she was the CIGI chair at Bolzilli. At the Bolzilli School at Wilfrid Laurier. And before that, she was at Carleton, in fact. So Rianne's work is on the changing gender composition of the labor force. And her work that I have found particularly useful is in the area of gender and social policy, and Rianne's done this amazing comparative work on policies in relation to childcare in a number of countries. Not Canada, Sweden is her second home in a way, academically speaking, but she has also worked in Australia, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, I don't know, a whole range, the US, so doing comparative social policy. She's also just retired as editor of the journal Social Politics, which is a leading journal in the field. So thank you, Rianne, for agreeing to read this book, not as an Africanist, of course, but as someone who knows this literature so well from a completely different perspective. And I think that will be really useful. Mary Owusu, a historian, instructor in the history department at Carleton, did her PhD in history at Dalhousie, and has worked on intellectual histories in Africa, is very interested in gender as well. Mary works on gender. She's worked in the area of development. So in addition to being an academic, she also has a sense of the policy world and the kinds of ways in which the framings and inscriptions, not encryptions, that take place in the everyday space kind of relate or don't relate to what governments imagine when they craft social policy. So welcome to all three of you. And welcome to everybody joining us from different parts of the world. We are going to do it as normal. Cati is going to present for us the key arguments in this book, which, by the way, did I say, won the Toyin Falola Prize in the Global Studies Association. So well done. Last year, Cati will present its central arguments, and then we'll have two discussants, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So I'm going to hand it over to Cati, who has a PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah, so let me just share this, and I think you can see it. So this book began with a building that was being constructed, cement block by cement block, as they are, behind the sanctuary of the main church in the town in southern Ghana, where I had been doing research since the late 1990s. So I asked, what is this building? And to my surprise, the response that it was going to be a senior day center. And I was astonished. And just to speak to the theme of knowing Africa and how we come to think what we think, this astonishment was very much shaped by the way that Ghanaians had emphasized a very strong boundary marker between the way my people, whoever they were, my people did elder care and the way that they did. So many Ghanaians celebrate their reliance on family in providing elder care, contrasting kin care with what they envision in Western countries, that is the discarding of older adults in residential facilities. So elder care became a way to organize cultural difference. It was inverting global hierarchies within this discourse, such that African tradition had a very highly positive valence, unlike in so many global comparisons. But it also romanticized Africa as a more communal place that takes care of people throughout the life course. Now, a day program is certainly not a residential facility, but it spoke to the construction of the senior day center by the church, spoke to changes in attitudes and new concerns about aging. And in fact, once I was sensitized to the issue in this way through this building, everywhere I looked, people seemed to be engaged in creating new institutions and programs for older adults, some inspired by ideas or experiences outside of Ghana, and others which were more homegrown, spreading laterally as people shared ideas about aging and elder care with one another. So I was prepared, because of the discourse on demographic aging, to see a society in transition in which a larger share of the population of Ghana would become old in a very short period of time, and that Ghanaian society was going to have to adjust from being a primarily youthful society to having more older people. I also thought Africa might do aging differently, and perhaps even provide new innovative models for aging and elder care, because certainly what I saw happening in the West wasn't working particularly well. So the way I decided to explore this phenomenon was through deliberate long-term research using short stays of about 2 months annually to track various changes in elder care. Now, in the rural areas, these activities were mainly charitable. Churches were organizing fellowship groups for older adults. And so on the left, this was a group that met every other week. And in this, of mainly older women, but not exclusively, in which they made a pudding of banana porridge, I guess you could say. And this was touted as, and then they ate it together. That was important too. It was touted as a way to eat something nutritious. It was also seen as an income generating activity that one could do in the house and sell from one's doorstep. On the right was a more common phenomenon organized by a church where older people gathered. Again, in this particular church, they gathered weekly, and they had just a series of playful activities, I would say. So it started out with doing exercises while they sang Presbyterian hymns because the church was Presbyterian. And then they went into playing games that are mainly associated with children, actually. Ludo, some physical activities, kind of a bocce game. And so they were just clearly having a lot of fun. And they talked about that as having, providing the opportunity for older adults to not be lonely and to get out of the house. In the urban areas, these activities were primarily commercial in the form of home nursing agencies and a very few residential facilities, as you can see on the right. These businesses were all very unstable, mainly because they were quite expensive, not because families didn't find the commercial activities attractive, but they just were not sure that they could pay for them. And in many of the children who were paying for him were mainly those abroad, although there were some sibling sets, you could say, who were pooling their resources, and all of them were in Ghana, and they could also afford these kind of services. But it was primarily only available for the middle class and the elite. So I tracked these things over time to see, whether things might develop in particular ways, whether things would become more popular. And so I'll return to the building 4 years later. By the end of December 2016, the day center was finally completed. It was beautiful, a striking addition to the landscape with its aquamarine paint. Its metallic fixtures shone brightly. A balcony graced the second floor. But to my eyes, the building looked more like the mansions that were being built in the capital Accra or along the hillsides around the town, rather than a residential facility where older adults might have trouble moving to a second floor or enjoying the balcony. The building was not open, and that was in part because there were conflicts within the church about whether it was going to be used as a senior day center. And ultimately, they took the decision that they would not do so. So in some ways, all of these initiatives, there was all of this bubbling up, all these initiatives, but they all seemed like this building, kind of a risk of failing, if one could call it that. And so as usual, the narrative with which I started the book, expecting to see a lot of change, that narrative had to radically change to another narrative, that this wasn't a narrative of sweeping social changes. And yet it was not as if this building and other initiatives didn't make some kind of difference. And so in many ways, the book is about false starts and the episodic and contingent ways that social change occurs. Things may be started but never get off the ground. And these inconsistencies speak to the limits of social change, to the ways that ideas fail to become routine practice because of the lack of shared understanding about goals or use of resources. And yet in the sputtering, the idea also takes shape and may gather resources, as this building did. So this church was known for its old age program. People thought about the Senior Day Center. And when I returned in 2019, the district assembly social workers were thinking about what the state might do, and what they pointed to were senior day centers. So this idea was somehow gaining traction, even though it had kind of sputtered out in this case. So even an unused building like this one can become a seed that germinates in spreading the idea and practices to others. So what this book explores is the way that changes in care of older persons in Ghana is happening in uneven and episodic ways, in which discourses and practices don't always match up. and in which some changes were subject to highly visible debate and others were invisible because practices were subtly modified such that discourses such as kin care became expansive enough to cover things like paid care. And I used what was happening, what I was seeing in aging in Ghana as a way of thinking about the contingent nature of social life in general and social change in particular. And I felt like I was pulling together all of my thinking over the years on this topic to make the argument of the book. So I came up with the concept of age inscription, which I'm not sure is completely the right idea, but I needed a concept that captured a kind of indeterminate and possibly transitional level of social change in culturally prescribed aging trajectories and life stages. Something that fell between social norms and individual practice. And I called it age inscription to illuminate the ways that transitions and expectations and markers around age and stages in the life course shift in practice. These inscriptions are based on individual and familial emotions and experiences and restrictions, as well as on actions of reflecting on and responding to processes of institutional and societal change. So I see it as positioned in between rules and laws and norms on the one hand, and individual feelings, emotions, and actions on the other. So inscription is always in the making, but is more standardized than individual behavior. And it emerges when some people are doing and believing and feeling in similar ways. However, it's not, and often not, maybe not yet, as standardized and shared within society as a norm. So I drew on a host of thinkers on this. I started with Bourdieu's concept of doxa and orthodoxy and heterodoxy. And doxa is what is so much taken for granted that we don't need to speak of it. It is maybe even below the level of consciousness. Whereas orthodoxy is, what is the party line? It is articulated. But the fact that it is articulated means that different perspectives can be oriented against it, like with heterodoxies. And so I was interested in all of these practices that were emerging that didn't seem to be considered heterodox and undermining the orthodoxy of kin care. So my initial beautiful word that I used to describe that was alterodoxy, things that were just different from kin care that weren't being recognized. But I got talked out of this term by my friends as something that just didn't slip off the tongue very well. Another person who had talked about this was the historian William Sewell, who talked about the fact that there can be a misfit between a social norm and the bulky world of lived experience. And what do people do in that? And Raymond Williams talks about structures of feelings and how feelings change in different periods, and that there's this period of kind of inchoateness of times where feelings are emergent, arising from lived experience, but haven't become structured and consistent again. And so I felt I was working in this margin between these emergent feelings and the next step of structures of feelings that he hadn't really developed. And their Komarovs as well in their early work on social changes among the Swana talked about this period of partial recognition, inchoate awareness, ambiguous perception, and sometimes creative tension. And I felt as if people were creating solutions to the problems that were affecting their lives, and that we were in a stage somewhat beyond partial recognition and ambiguous perception, where things had begun to kind of solidify. And the processes that I saw as really significant in making this unease coherent One process was the substitution of adjacent relations. And here I was primarily interested in the development of paid care, and how this developed out of relations of fosterage and domestic service, and how these agencies built on something that was familiar to people, particularly in the urban environment, but also in rural ones, ways that had supported women who were engaged in social reproduction as well as economic labor, and that those were being mobilized then for elder care. And it meant that home care in one's home was far more attractive because it was closer to that adjacent relation than something that took older people outside of their homes. Another way of making the unease coherent is that the heterodoxy can easily become an orthodoxy. So in the case of Ghana, the orthodoxy was kin care, the heterodoxy was residential facilities associated with the West. And I was just very interested in how some older people expressed a kind of desire for residential facilities, and for the kind of recognition that a building might offer for state care. And they amalgamated this to boarding schools, which they had experienced as young people, places of physical hardship for sure, but also ones where they had connected with their peers and created lifelong friendships. So they had a kind of, when they thought about what are the possibilities beyond kin care, residential facilities was there as the heterodoxy on which people could possibly turn. But I was also feeling like the heterodoxy was also a kind of straitjacket in a way, not allowing people to think about other possibilities. There was also very much another way that this unease can become coherent, and I think this is just really important cognitively, is through comparison and through hierarchies. This is one way that we make sense of the world and begin to think about things. And finally, that there was that one can maintain a social norm through a new age inscription. And so here too, I thought paid care was quite interesting, because rather than treating paid care as meaning that the family was falling apart in terms of its obligations, people reworked the meaning of the payments. So the people who were paying for paid care were the children, and so they were providing kin care by virtue of paying for the elder care of their relatives. So there is much more than I can say here, but I was trying to map out this very this changing environment, but in which things were also very much in process, and to try and capture some of that. So I really look forward to the comments of Rianne and Mary, and thanks for your generosity in reading the book and commenting on it. I look forward to it.
Thanks, Cati. Mary, I wonder if we could turn to you and then Rianne last.
Hello. So I'll start off with my own summary of the book, and then I'll end with some questions that I will leave for the audience. So when I first saw the title of the book, Changes in Care, I didn't know it was about Ghana until I opened the book. So, and reading the introduction, I told myself, this is a very important book. And for Ghana and Africa, and why do I say that? Because this book looks at how do we effectively care for the aged, but not just that. Changes in Care, as I saw it, provides a usable document about how the voices of Ghana's aged in rural and urban settings could be factored into policy making. The education, the miseducation or poor education of care providers, that that's how I saw the education of the care providers, either miseducation or poor education. That informal care management and care provision, these are all topics that are touched on. But the factors that come into play are rural-urban migrations of both the aged and their caregivers and managers, the financial burden and planning that should exist in elder care, and the somewhat diminishing occurrence of a multi-generational living. So for me, the interactions of these key themes as presented in Changes in Care are enough to declare it a very important book. So Cati uses the everyday ways of elder care to highlight that there are significant changes in the seeming continuity of the traditional family as caregiver to the elderly in Ghana. Now, while the book challenges the Ghanaian government's position of the family as the unit responsible for elder care, it also draws out the continuing relevance of the family in elder care management. And this is what I see as the genius of the book, the ways in which it states the facts and ensures that both sides are heard. Then there is the interesting phenomenon of the senior day centers, and which I will jump. But what struck me as a Ghanaian was the understandings of senior homes from the aged, Ghanaian aged, as a place of reunion, a place of reenacting past boarding school practices, and generally a place of positivity. This, if juxtaposed against the dissatisfaction expressed by elders in actual senior homes in Ghana, although we have only 3, but this is presented. So Cati shows that the people surveyed in the Eastern region presented varieties of care, and what the book identifies as heterodox and ultradox practices, some problematic, some empathetic, but at the heart of it was the fact that there was hardly a case of full abandonment of the elderly, and that's an important takeaway I took. That said, Changes in Care raises the issue of remuneration for caregivers and the need for the Ghanaian government to reconsider long-held, what I would say, utopic ideas about the traditional family as provider of care for the elderly. So as a historian, I appreciated the attempts to capture early recorded elder care practices, mostly from the 19th century. And I felt that this is a start for any historian seeking to explore this issue further. I should also say, Cati, that you have redeemed anthropologists, at least in my eyes, because they have had traditionally a very, very bad rap, if nothing at all in intellectual history. You know, these anthropologists who are on record to have looked everywhere to find the worst forms of African life, to show how Africans needed to be civilized. So your work changed my view about anthropologists, because you have produced a book that is very respectful of both your positionality and the Ghanaians you interacted with. And the anthropologists, today's ones, no doubt, will have many themes from which to glean their next research topics. Of course, some will find issues to raise, because what is a good book if it does not initiate a disagreement because of its deviation from the norm? So I would say Changes in Care is informative, it is well-researched, and it is provocative. And you should look forward to people writing back Now, some of the questions I had was with language. So research is always written for an audience, and for the Guinean audiences like myself, I found the more Marxian discourses around care, so who gets paid and all that, to be the area that presented the most questions. What, for example, do we mean when we mention vulnerable caregivers to a Guinean audience? So how may this picture of a vulnerable caregiver change in, say, North America? And how then do we find the words for something for which geography should be ingrained in our understandings of it? Again, you did your best to situate the Guinean position in terms of the vulnerability, but it still left me with questions about words and how geography matters when you're using some of these words. So again, some other questions would be for me, what could we find if we explored this topic as women's work, for which they should be properly remunerated? And could a well-planned and executed elder care regime that starts with proper curriculum development lead to labor expansion? So this is the policy aspect, and perhaps further integration of rural economies with the national. Could an intentional and government-led targeted intervention ease or augment individualized care programs to create a more holistic and uniquely Guinean care regime? So I leave you with these thoughts and my suspicion that this book will inform policy in Ghana. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Hattie, we'll take Rianne's comments first, and then you could respond to both. Yeah.
Okay, let me begin by saying, Shireen, thank you for a lovely introduction. What you don't know is that when I started graduate school, I wanted to be an Africanist. But Cran Pratt, who was the Dean of African Studies at U of T, said, now was the time for Africans to tell their own stories, so I could do work on Canada's relations with Africa, which didn't seem to be sufficiently imperialist enough to be interesting. So I switched paths. But I've retained an interest in Africa. Anyway, I'm very glad you asked me to participate in this discussion. I really, really enjoyed the book. I thought, Cati, you made excellent use of very rich results of your field research to produce a multifaceted account of aging, migration, and social class in Accra and rural Ghana. I'm also, like Mary, I'm going to start with my little summary, which would be a little different, but we always read things in our own way. So I especially loved your nuanced treatment of theorization of change. As somebody who comes from, among other things, a tradition of historical institutionalism, I've always felt uncomfortable with the rather static path dependency argument that runs through historical institutionalism, partly because it makes it very difficult to imagine path-breaking change. Which doesn't always have to be very revolutionary. It can come in small ways. And what I loved about your book was the beautiful way, the very highly nuanced way in which you dealt with this. In fact, if I were teaching still, which I'm not any longer since I retired, your first chapter would be something I would actually have on my curriculum, because I think it's just superb, even if you're not writing about elder care in Ghana. So I think I love your idea of inscriptions, which you talk about as social experiments that emerge as people begin feeling and thinking their way through a social problem to which existing norms do not provide adequate answers. So in this case, social change from the orthodoxy of family and daughter care is being driven by population aging, internal and external migration, and changing class formations, all taking place against a global horizon. Yet, as you nicely argue, that this change is taking place in messy and uneven ways, giving rise to these heterodoxies and alterodoxies. I had to learn how to say that, but I think it is a neat idea. I also like the way that you highlighted the agency of the elderly. And I was taken by the example which you actually mentioned of how, in imagining how things could be different, some of them will hark back to their high school days and remember the good sides of living in residence. That kind of positive experience of long-term care is something that is very rare now in North America. But I know when in Quebec, the French-speaking province of Canada began to develop publicly supported elder care in the 1970s, it was actually good quality care for those who had already given to society. So it was a kind of imagination that in fact might better fit with the people in Ghana are thinking of, and maybe what we are thinking about in Canada today too. Finally, I also love the way in which you dealt with the fact of external influence. Certainly the financial capital in the form of remittances, the social capital in the form of the stories that migrants bring back, and the role of donors all play a role. But as you rightly argue, this always filtered through local traditions and cultures. I think those are all really great points. Now, I thought it might be useful to then move on to kind of raise some questions by taking one of the issues that you deal with and putting it in relation to debates in the North, which is the limits to the expansion of professional home helps in the urban areas. In the Global North, feminist economists and mainstream sociologists like Esping Anderson talk about the issue of Beaumont's disease, which has got to do with the cost pressures arising in labor-intensive care services in economies where wages are set in relation to capital and technology-intensive sectors. So one of the things, you've got a sort of a wage system there. What do you do about this very labor-intensive work, which cannot be replaced by machines? Well, one of the unfortunate solutions that has been taken is to drive down the wages by bringing in, among others, low-paid migrant workers and exploiting them. It also is involved in Canada and I think the United States, a decrease in staff ratios. So the quality of elder care has gone down, and it's gone down in a way which has also sacrificed equity. The alternative, with which the feminists and even Esping Anderson argue, is for public investment in the care economy, in publicly financed care, provided on a universal basis to all who need it, and provided at equitable wages. And one of the points that I would also want to make is it should be also largely through public or nonprofit hospice. And if we want to, we can talk about why I'm saying that, but I'll just leave it at that. Now, in Cati's case, and much of the Global South, it's less a question of BOMO than of the existence of a large informal economy and continuing access to women's unpaid labor. But that doesn't mean that the care economy is a solution just for the North. As the ILO, UNDP, and Oxfam are arguing, it's also of interest to the Global South in a way of creating decent jobs, which also makes it easier for people to stay rather than having to go. If you have a more decent job being created in Ghana, you have less pressures for you to go abroad to find decent work and to provide quality services. So why is this not happening in Ghana? I think I like also one of the other points that you make, which I really liked, was that it's not because the Ghanaian state's been won over to neoliberalism. If you look at what it's done, it has invested in public health care and the Livelihood Empowerment Against Poverty program, which focuses on children and women. And it's interesting when you talk about that, you refer to the role of donors, but you don't actually talk about the concept that they're using, which was the one that came up. You had neoliberalism said, well, you can't, sort of any expenditure on social policy is a waste, so cut, cut, cut. And along came the idea of social investment, which said, well, you can invest in children because they're capital, human capital in the making, and you can invest in working age women because they're potentially human capital is here to be used now, but you don't invest in the elderly because, hey, they're spent human capital. But the nice thing is that there is a change taking place now, as I suggested, in donor interest in the care economy. So I wondered whether the growth of a middle class in Ghana might help create the domestic political base for such a solution. Now, my thinking again is partly inspired by what I know about the Swedish case, because their farmers, workers, and the middle class constitute an alliance, and that's what actually provided the political underpinnings for the expansion of the kind of welfare state that most of us have looked to as the kind of ideal, including, in fact, investment in social care. But it's not just, you say, well, Sweden and Ghana, they're very different worlds, true. But there's also the case of Latin America, where there's substantial interest in the care economy, and where in countries like Colombia, the idea of a care economy has been able to kind of overcome the gap between middle-class feminists in urban areas and domestic workers, and allowed for an alliance which allowed movement forward for both groups. So I wondered whether such a possibility might not occur in Ghana, and if you saw any sort of signs of light in that direction. And I have a last question, which deals more with a more limited but potentially helpful solution, which you do talk about. HelpAge International has played a really crucial role in Africa in spreading the idea of social pensions. But what was interesting in your story is that this isn't the case with HelpAge Ghana. And I was really perplexed by why is HelpAge Ghana so different from HelpAge as it is in the rest of Africa, where it has actually been an important force for these social pensions. And I'll leave it there.
Oh,
Great.
fabulous.
Thanks so much to both of you.
Thank you. Yes, they're amazingly thoughtful responses. Cati, do you want to respond to some of those points that were made and a couple of questions that Mary raised as well? Or do you want?
I'm wondering, I didn't fully understand your first question about the vulnerable caregiver. You seem to say that that was an inappropriate term in the context of Ghana, and maybe I'm not understanding it fully. Maybe you could explain why you think so.
No. So not so much that it is an inappropriate term in the context of Ghana, but it's a term that when used, the use of language, and for me, it's okay. I think an easy example for me is the concept of homelessness in Ghana, which you probably would be familiar with. So Kayaye would travel from the north and come to Ghana, to come to the south to work. Now, that concept of them being homeless in the south exists because they are in the south. Are they homeless, completely homeless? No. If they were to go back to the north, they would not be homeless. So it's that same concept for the vulnerable women who provide the care, that these women, as compared to, say, my immigrant women in the West, who are usually sometimes overeducated for the position that they are engaged in, right? So their vulnerability is of a different shade from these ones in Ghana, who, for which my question is, could they get another job?
Mm.
Do they have the qualifications to get another job? And for most of them, the answer would be no. If they were not doing this work, what's the alternative? The alternative is no work and no money, right? So that vulnerability, if looked within the space of what's available to that person because of, the lived everything, the environment of that person, then makes me, because when I had read, fortunately or unfortunately, I had read a paper from someone who was complaining about the vulnerable immigrants in the West doing care. And then I read this, and so that it jumped out to me, the concept of vulnerable here and the concept of vulnerable there. Yeah. So I was a little, I couldn't come up with a different word, forgive me, but I thought it did not fully express the positioning of such women.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, you're right that vulnerability has become a category of its own in Ghana. And in a way, you're right of should one use it or not? Because it's particularly in term with children, vulnerable children.
Yeah.
And I also felt that even as older people were advocating on their behalf, they were sometimes trying to get out of this being framed as vulnerable. So they wanted to be recognized for their previous contributions, not as vulnerable. So this vulnerable category is quite has its own sort of stakes in it. It is a category that's emerged. But I would also say, having also looked at caregivers, African caregivers in the United States, and from tracking the caregivers in Ghana, a few of whom went to South Africa or the Gulf, that they have different vulnerabilities. So for example, exposure to racism or having their passport taken from them in the Gulf. So there were different kinds of vulnerabilities that they experienced. And so you're right that immigrants abroad are considered in a very different situation than those who weren't. And many of the paid caregivers that I looked at wanted to go abroad, were sort of preparing themselves for a different kind of exploitation, in a way, is the way I thought of it. So I guess I would also say that those abroad also experience vulnerabilities, but in a different sense than they're not totally, they have resources as well, and that people are using them at all times. You make an excellent point about framing this in terms of women's work, and a part of me thought, I'm just looking at how women are doing this work under different conditions to kind of continue this theme of, are they doing it under the auspices of kin care, or as domestic slaves in the 19th century, or as paid caregivers? Under what auspices do they get roped in, and what are the different obligations and rewards that come to them as a result of the different ways that they are engaged in care? The point, so to Rianne, your questions about public pressure, I was very interested in this. Was public pressure going to emerge? And many of the elderly people the older adults were highly critical of the state. And I was kind of waiting to see whether it would become some kind of pressure group. There are quite a few academics who are also working on aged care, and academics do cycle in and out of government. So they have a maybe outsized influence because they do move in and out of government. So I wondered what kind of alliance would emerge. The other pressure point was were daughters, or the people who would get roped into caregiving. But the fact that people were solving, the commercial care services were, it was only available to those who had money, who were solving the problem in this way. And so it didn't feel like it could expand. It would expand, but I wasn't seeing movement in that regard, might be the way to put it. The charitable stuff was also quite interesting, but I felt as if it was mainly focused on those older people who were active and who could get to those fellowship groups, rather than those who really were at the highest risk of neglect, who might be bedridden or suffer from dementia. And so I spent quite a bit of thinking about, what kind of model was there anything that I was seeing that could be a policy recommendation, in a sense, for the Ghanaian government, heavily indebted, not without a lot of feeling that it could support more social welfare, being criticized for the kind of social welfare that it had provided in terms of healthcare and education, that it was too fast, not well thought out, a big drain on the budget. So I wasn't sure that that was going to happen. Social pensions, I think, so what was going on with HelpAge in Ghana, may have been the result of particular personalities and just sort of organizational chaos. But it was also interesting to me that they had moved from a position of providing support for older adults to being concerned with advocacy, which then seemed to get them in a way into a dead end, into a way where they weren't connected to the wider public, but really just focused on government. And social pensions are are being used in some African countries like Kenya. And so I did expect that through the AU that some of these, there might be some conversations about this. And Ghana might say, well, if Kenya, South Africa is one thing, they can't imitate South Africa, but if Kenya can do it, we can do it. But there didn't seem to be much movement in that regard either. So we'll see what happens with this, but I didn't feel too hopeful about either of those developing at this particular historical and political moment in Ghana. But thank you so much for these really thoughtful questions, and also for these excellent summaries, which were, I thought, kind of fleshed out the book in the way that, in a way, our different angles did mean that the whole book got represented. So thanks for your sense of what was important in it.
Yes, thank you to both of you. So I'm going to open it up for some discussion. And if you could raise your hand, I'll call on you, and you could unmute and turn on your camera. That would be great. Well, we're wait. Oh, there's Belinda. Go ahead, Belinda.
Yeah, hi, Cati. That was wonderful, and Rianne and Mary. I liked your comments too. I'm a migration scholar person, and I'm intrigued thinking about your work, and I haven't read the book, but can you tell us more about how it relates to internal mobility within Ghana? I mean, who are the paid care workers and where are they coming from? I mean, is there a care chain like the global care chain that's happening domestically?
Yeah, what a great question. I struggled with this issue of care chains, and ultimately I decided there was not one, partly because there was no recruitment. These home nursing agencies would have loved to kind of create a recruitment stream with the global north, but that was not happening. And so these were kind of independent phenomena. One of the ways that migration was playing into this was that migrant daughters were maybe more reluctant to return home to Ghana to provide care that they felt they ought to. So the remittances were certainly fueling paid care, but they were essentially, people were replacing themselves. So in that sense, the global care chain made sense. Some of those migrants were working as care workers, but the vast majority were not, right? And they understood those remittances as a form of kin care. There was also women who were urban migrants were also engaged in the same practice. So the expectations was that, so when I talk to older adults in this small town in the Eastern region, it was clear that this older generation of women in their 70s and 80s had returned to the hometown as a safety net, where sometime between their 40s and their 60s, and they performed the care slot, is the way I thought of it, based on some work in Peru by Jessica Lena Waver, where they were caring for the older generation and their children would send the grandchildren back to live with them. And so they had done this, but now their daughters were reluctant to return home because it meant a loss of economic income generation from the commercial towns. And essentially we're seeing, the towns are the places where all the economic action is. So to return to the hometown was seen as deliberate impoverishment. Their brothers and their children, who had sent them grandchildren, their brothers and their children were supposed to be sending remittances, but of course it was never sufficient. So one of the more interesting things was that I found that there were some women in this small town who had returned home to care for their aging parents and to take in the grandchildren, who were then working for their neighbors, for the daughters who hadn't returned home. And this arrangement was being negotiated as a gift, in a sense. The wages were quite minimal, and the care was quite minimal as well. But so paid care was also emerging in these rural towns as well, because daughters were not moving back. But there was also older people were being brought to live with their children in the cities. And this meant a loss of, social networks, no longer being able to go to their church where everyone knew them. It was a little bit lonely, because adults work, outside the home, and they have long commutes. And so older adults would also complain about the poor care they received in those contexts. So migration was really important in terms of these remittances that was fueling paid care, I would say. But I didn't see that really clear architecture that was developed in the global care chains. And it wasn't always about migrants. Women, so that was the other part of it, was that women were facing constraints on their time. And so they were, paid care became one of the solutions that they turned to.
Thank you. Any other comments? Maybe I'll jump in while people are thinking. I see you, Charles. I'll come to you in a second. But Cati, I was really intrigued by your attention to the structures of feeling and to these affective dimensions of aging, but also in provision of care. So, your attention to loneliness was very moving. It affectively moved me reading it. I wondered about the gender dimensions of this. So you speak in the book about the obligation of care on men being to provide funding rather than physical care, but that some women now who earn sufficient amount of cash are also able to kind of enter that status, right, where they are sending home money and then somebody else is providing the care. So in a sense, they're sort of stepping out of their gendered role as expected. So it's part of your story of the sort of hesitant and complicated way in which change is taking place. I wonder what that did for the feeling of self-worth. Did women feel they had to send the money and go home at particular moments in the year to provide particular kinds of care in order to show that they were still connected to the family and was still performing dutifully the role of a good woman, or did so is there in fact still a double burden on women? And were there instances when they now are, for example, in South Africa, there are many instances of men providing care, and there certainly were during the AIDS pandemic, in many households, and young boys were taking over care roles because the parents had AIDS. But your discussion of these shifts gave me a way to read that as well, because it's not talked about very publicly, because it challenges what it means to be a good man and a good woman. So I wondered how they were navigating those, the relationship between self-worth and one's sense of obligation and duty and then, changing gender roles in the economy. And did that shift fall more heavily on women than it did on men? Like, did men just feel, well, we don't have to do that care at all, and it in some sense is so much easier if you are employed to send money rather than to actually do the labor of care.
Yeah, those are great questions. So women certainly got criticized by paid caregivers for being insufficiently caring daughters. So it was a way for the care workers to feel superior and to have a little bit of leverage within that relationship, was to criticize the women they were working for, who were not. And this is pretty typical in a lot of work on domestic servants, that this is something they will kind of use to say the woman who's employing me is not a good woman, right? The women themselves, how did it affect their self-worth? I found a whole range on that. Some women just said, I'm not going to feel guilty, or at least that's what they told me in the interviews with me. This is justifiable. I can't do this. Other women did feel more guilt, and I would also say that in terms of, was a double burden still happening? Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I particularly saw it when there were crises. I was very interested when an older person was living with an adolescent child in a kind of fostering relationship. Well, what happened when the older person needed to go to the hospital? So knowing that, what an adolescent, my sense of what an adolescent can do, adolescents in Ghana can do far more than, the kind of age expectations of that period of the life are very different. But still, a trip to the hospital. And so the trips to the hospital brought the daughters home, and they managed what you could say those care crises. How did the men feel? That is also a really good question. There were some sons who I heard about who had taken in who had taken in a father who was disabled, for example, and those relationships didn't go well. People needed to find another solution to those problems, to that. In a sense, they weren't seen as good caregivers, and so they were avoided in a way. But there were also some men who were working as paid caregivers, and they were they also tended to pride themselves on being nurses, or tried to position themselves as being nurses, and talked about the professionalization of care work, in a sense. So there were men providing care, and you're absolutely right that often men providing care is just invisible. It's practiced but not talked about and not recognized because of gendered norms around this.
Thank you. Charles?
Yes. Thank you very much for the opportunity. In fact, I have always, wished to meet Professor Cati Coe, because her books did the wonders for me, both for my doctoral studies and my recent work here in the UK. And so I was very delighted when my professor who taught me during my undergraduate studies, Dr. Mary Owusu, invited me to participate in the conversation. Strangely, I had not seen her book. And so once I had to look for a copy to begin reading. Of course, that was today. So I had a chance of reading the introduction. And my knowledge of her works, I know she's been very sympathetic to Africanist scholarship. I'm putting Africanist in quote because I know it's also a highly politically charged concept. But then I was never disappointed, as usual, when I started reading the text. And really, I enjoyed reading it because I see a continuation of her work and that of one of my foremost professors at the University of Ghana, Professor Christine Opon, whose work I'm very sure Professor Cati Coe will very much aware about, because Professor Opon had begun this kind of research in the late 1960s, obviously having been trained by Jack Goody. Her interest was exactly what Professor Cati Coe is also doing. How are the forces of modernization impacting the family system, and more recently, as we see happening, the caring of the aged. And again, it also links me to the theories that we find Professor Cati Coe is using. And when I started reading it, I said, well, it's almost like always trying to find the gap between the real and the ideal, and which indeed has always been the case. If you look at the works of early Ghanaian scholars, such as John Mason Saba, who in the 19th century, writing about a family, discusses the fact that there is what comes across as conventional practice or conventional normative structures of family orientation, and then what comes across as undercurrent practices that, though may not be legitimized in the public sphere to be accepted, but also exist in the realm of family structure. So both ways, I see a kind of continuity in intellectual historical scholarship in the case of Ghanaian family structures and systems. Now, having said that, I would like to also contribute to the conversation about who takes care of the aged. There is an insightful work by one Ghanaian professor, historian, professor of history, Professor Krampari, who looks at the aftermath of so-called abolishment of enslavement, especially at a domestic level, because in terms of what happened across the Atlantic or the Arab world, we know either they were brought back or they were, quote unquote, assimilated in ways that very unequal, which of course, again, Cati Coe's work brings it out in terms of modern forms of servitude in the US and of course, even in the UK. But then, in terms of who takes care of the aged, what comes across in Professor Krampari's work is the idea of abawa, where you have people who once upon a time would have been considered like the pawns, pawn ship sort of. And then with the end of enslavement or whatever it was, or colonialism, there was a transformation, a kind of transitioning of that practice into abawa today. But that was an intervention in terms of who takes care of the growing elitist population at the time, of course, which Professor Opon's work made a very good intervention. But then again, currently in Ghana, we know the case of free senior secondary school education. That has also meant that you wouldn't have free hands to take care of the aged, because education has become a major entry point of social and political mobility, such that many years ago, if you had a child or a grandchild who would sit next to you and take care of you, in the case of the work of Van der Geest. So I was very happy when Prof also cited the works of Van der Geest, where in the case of the Kowe area. Now you don't have these young girls anymore. They are all in school. And so that in itself raises its own complications. And that also fits into the political economy of what men do these days. Because if you look at the work of Overa, in terms of men, when men do the work of women, and that also comes with, again, the professionalization of gendered roles, where this time old men will, or let's say young men, like some of us, will not see the gendered aspect of taking care of an aged person, but instead the professional aspect of it. And so that is an important aspect that we may want to consider going forward. Now, having said that, I grew up in urban slum, Muslim dominated community. I don't know whether Prof knows Mamobi and Nima. Now, in those areas, there's a concept of baraka, which is religious. I know you concentrate on the Christian aspect. Then the baraka was a major intervention, which is grace. So growing up, we were told that if you helped an aged person, you were given baraka. And I recall as children, you always wanted to help the aged person to get baraka. But the issue is also that the idea of baraka itself is falling, because people are beginning to think of baraka as material reciprocity, as opposed to just the blessing that they may not experience in the immediate, but rather in the hereafter. Again, this leads me to the issue of reciprocity. And obviously, you mentioned it in your work, which other Ghanaian scholars like Professor Aridoba, whose work you may be aware, has also mentioned that the aged do not have what to give in order to receive something in return. And you give a case of where in, I think, is it Madagascar or Malawi, where you talk about the aged having this indigenous knowledge that allows them, so epistemic control of the younger generation, which will then cover the younger generation to take care of them. But today there's a change. The internet revolution, the onset of social media, which has also democratized knowledge to some extent. All these have impacted the care of the aged. And so finally, I'll talk about the case of trust and the pay care industry. In the case of the Western world, there's a DBS where people's backgrounds are properly scrutinized. In the case of Ghana, we have instances where the aged are abused by those who are paid to take care of them. Maybe going forward, these are areas we may want to pick up and then build upon in terms of scholarship in this field. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. I'm sorry to cut you short, but we just have till 2:20 so, and then people have to go off to their next class. Cati, anything you want to respond to? There were a lot of.
Yeah, thank you so much for those excellent comments. I mean, yeah, I felt I was standing really on the shoulder of giants in many ways in this book. There really was a lot of scholarship on aging and family life from the past and on slavery that meant I could, just kind of in terms of getting sort of information from the 1950s and the 1970s that I could turn to that other work and have a sense of the way things were going. And I think you're right about this point about how reciprocity, some of the ways that I'm still struggling with in a way, like what is the difference that paid care makes in relationships? Because it feels to me as if kin relations are also becoming commodified in some ways, in the way that you discuss, in which reciprocity has come to mean financial support, whereas it meant something broader in the past. And so anyway, that just kind of, I've just been thinking about those issues. And your point too, in a way, is servitude a temporary position of adolescents who are brought into a household for a short period of time and then launched into an apprenticeship like seamstressing or hairdressing or tailoring. And what has happened with schooling, with the expansion of schooling and the expansion of free schooling, as you say, is those young people are no longer available to help women run their households. And they are being replaced with adult women who are, it seems to be becoming an occupation that is then permanent. And so there's something also, we didn't talk a lot about social class, but what's happening is that these relations of vulnerability, perhaps if we could go back, if we could use that word, or are now in a way becoming hardened, and this is much more of a social class relation, as opposed to a life course one, or one where different positions in the life course become the basis for who owes what to whom, in a sense, what kind of labor is expected from people and what kind of reward do they expect as a result of their labor. So thank you so much for raising all of those issues, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you. If there are no last comments or questions, I mean, I have several. Can I raise one more? We've got 5 minutes before people really do start to leave. I think, and it's tied to what you just said, when I read the book, I was thinking very much about older debates about replacing private patriarchy with public patriarchy. Those sorts of debates about what was worse, what was better. And I felt very strongly reading this, but also thinking, as somebody who is caught between, an older mother and my own children, that's sandwiching between these generations, the difference the kinds of senses of obligations that have to be met, even though one's own life has really become so complicated, right? So in this partial commodification, let's call it that, there's a kind of partial commodification of care in Ghana. It seems to me it's neither one thing nor the other, that there isn't that paid care doesn't adequately compensate, doesn't provide, the people providing the care don't have a sense necessarily of being valued in the work they do, because it's very low-level remuneration. But at the same time, you have a whole lot of people who are providing care in a non-commodified way, who are also wandering around feeling like there's a lack of recognition there, right? So it feels to me like you, in your theoretical chapter, lay out so well that change doesn't happen with everybody moving along at the same pace, right? And that these are this kind of bricolage of arrangements that exists at any one time, and the kind of inconsistencies between real world arrangements and policies and orthodoxies about what is expected, including orthodoxies of the church, that they can produce a very unsatisfying situation. And I wondered about whether these were the basis, and Rianne sort of posed it a little bit, but didn't, we haven't talked about it. Well, how does it affect politics? How does it affect alliance building between women and women's organizations? Or do you have these very well-meaning, respectable organizations of church women that are also moralizing projects that are not offering ways out, that are kind of validating? Is that, it's a very complicated, messy question, but I'm thinking that in this bricolage of arrangements, how do you create forms of politics that might take us to somewhere different? And is there a politics around care that's happening in Ghana?
Yeah, I would say very little in that. Very little politics of care. And it's also clear how, I mean, I think much of the work around the care economy is also about connecting care receivers and caregivers and finding a way that they can find solidarity with one another, such that if the working conditions are good, then people receive better care. But what I was seeing was really a lot of tensions between caregivers and care receivers, and particularly between women. It also felt to me like the men were really taking the lead in terms of any kind of political movement. I think that had to do with their feeling of entitlement and their sense that this was a kind of status degradation. So they felt they could say something, and it was mainly oriented to the state. And I think women were also much more, anyway, so these questions are really good, but I think women felt like they could handle this through raising their children in a particular way, even though that didn't always work out. Whereas the men felt more vulnerable to being abandoned by their children because of their past actions. And so I think that also played into why they were the only ones, or the main ones, asking for some kind of public commitment to care. But it was haphazard. It was in side comments. It was in there was very little on this in the wider political landscape. I would say that older the issues of older people was really not being addressed in any way. And that the state had essentially said, I mean, as Mary said, the state had essentially said that elder care is in the hands of family, and that had stifled a lot of discussion. But thank you for your beautiful summary of the book. So I really appreciate that too, that what you just said before the question was very, very helpful to me.
Well, thank you, Cati, for a great book. Thank you, Mary and Rianne, for your great interventions. It's a long conversation and will continue, I think. These are ongoing debates, and the more we hit economic crisis, the bigger the problems become, the greater the gaps, and the more the burdens fall on the usual suspects. So I think we'll be discussing this for a very long time to come. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Our next discussion is going to be on Amanda Swar's book, Envisioning Intersex in Africa, and we will have as discussants Anne Svetkovich from Women and Gender Studies at Carleton, and Jabu Pereira, who is a intersex and trans activist in South Africa. So that's going to be a little change of tack, but actually not as much as you might think, because care is written into all of those discussions as well. So thank you, everyone, for coming. I know everyone a lot of the Carleton people have to rush off for class, which begins soon. And yeah, thank you.